So I'm at the constituency office of Jonathan Reynolds waiting for an audience with him. Quite an impressive room in an old building. So I'm here with Jonathan Reynolds, my MP. We were going to meet at the conference. I was cycling to get the conference, and we were going to meet at the conference, but it's more practical to meet here.
It's nice to hear it in Hyde Town Hall. For me, conference it's a big event. I mean, this was the biggest Labour Party conference in history, so there's 18,500 people there. For me, there's a lot of responsibilities around sort of fringe events, speaking to members. As a business secretary, a lot of businesses attend. Your main speech on conference floor. So yes, rather than any delay, I'm sure you'll be cycling there on time down the M62 or the East Lancs Road. But it's nice to do this here. So yeah, really appreciate the chance to have a conversation and a few words for the club.
Yeah, I didn't cycle here in this way.
Yeah.
So how did the conference go for you? I mean, you must be on cloud 9 after last night.
It was really nice, thank you. It was. It's a big event. I mean, in some ways you might ask why we still have conferences. I mean, the days where everyone had to meet in a seaside town to decide what we were going to say and talk about, obviously that's gone, but it's a chance it's a good platform, it brings people together. I mean, it's actually one of the biggest political meetings in Europe, Labour Party conference, because of the scale of it. So, look, I mean, I've been the MP here since 2010, and we've been through quite a few elections in that time. There's no way for us to deny that Labour got beaten very badly in 2019. I mean, even a seat like this, it was tough. We've held in this seat since the Second World War, and obviously the overall vote share and number of seats was really our lowest result. 1935 was worse, but we were actually increasing at that point, So it was really tough. And I think when you've had that, it's not easy, but you've got to be willing to acknowledge that defeat. This doesn't change what you believe or what you want to do, but you've got to accept why did people, why in a seat like this was it so hard to get Labour voters to vote Labour? And so we've changed the party a lot. We've tried to acknowledge those mistakes. We've still got more to do, but I think if you saw the reaction to it, the kind of things we're putting forward, what I feel are the real nuts and bolts problems that are problems in Britain. So housing, access to housing, infrastructure, poor transport, the skills system, Brexit and why it's not working properly and why it's going to work better. Most of all, the economy. I mean, you can't get round the fact, Daniel, that our economy hasn't grown as we broadly expect the British economy to grow since 2010. And as a result, a lot of people are really unaware that as it stands today, if the Conservative Party, if there was no election coming, their own plans include, for instance, really tough stuff. I mean, the freezing of all tax allowances for 6 years. Departmental spending cuts in the next parliament. I don't think that's what people really expect or hope for at the minute. So it's a challenging situation, but I think that and the by-elections we've seen, we couldn't have, even though this government isn't popular, I acknowledge that, we wouldn't have seen that support come to Labour unless we'd been frank and acknowledged that. And I obviously take a lot of pride in that. More to do, but people are listening to Labour again. That is important.
Yeah. What was actually the highlight of the policies announced at conference for you?
So for me, I mean, obviously all of my area is around industrial strategy and around the economy. Something that's really important for me is because I grew up in a part of the country. I only came to Manchester when I was 18, and I grew up in the northeast, and that was a time of big changes. I mean, everyone worked in coal mining where I was from. Obviously that had to change. Shipbuilding was very big. I think how the UK managed those changes wasn't great. I think a lot of the problems, really levelling up as a government slogan, is really about the parts of the country that had a tough time in that big deindustrialisation. It's not that people think everyone should still work in coal mining, but how you manage that change. Are you helping people through, or are you letting people just bear the brunt of that? I think there's a lot of lessons to learn from that. So I was trying to get that message across in my speeches as the business secretary, and people really responded to that. It's maybe more of an emotional message around climate change than a rational one about, we're going to phase out gas and coal and we're going to have renewable energy. And, I want to get across that human element to it, I suppose. But the other thing that's outside my area is I am really, really animated and worried about housing. I think young people today in this country have not got a reasonable offer. I think the price of housing, the fact that a lot of people, if they can't afford to buy, even the rental market isn't secure, it isn't good. It's really at the heart of so many problems. And you saw, particularly from Keir Starmer in his speech, just very frank, we've got to build homes. I can't say it any other way. We've got to build them. Talking about the new towns, which were a big success post-war in Britain. I say they're a big success. I mean, about 5 million British people live in new towns. Where would we be without them? So a focus on good jobs and good houses, I'm pretty happy with that.
Yeah, I mean, as a parent myself, I'm extremely worried at house prices and even rental prices. I'm actually afraid I won't be able to get them out of my house.
Yes, no, absolutely.
So
and people might think, people are aware the southeast, London has very high housing prices. We do see it here, don't we? I mean, Mosley's a place with, not cheap to get it. And, it's a great place to live, wonderful people, lovely town, great schools, great spaces, great businesses. So of course people want that, but we're seeing this everywhere. And I'll be frank, it's quite hard at times, because a lot of the time I do get a lot of letters from people saying they just don't want more houses built. They want houses, but maybe not built near them. And I think what the new towns did was, it was a model for how to provide infrastructure alongside homes. So it was where you got the facilities, the services, transport needs around that. We can learn from that, definitely. So it was a really welcome focus.
Are we possibly going to see the revival of a council house programme?
Well, absolutely. Social housing is going to be part of that. Where we are now in Tameside and Greater Manchester, we've had a model that's been mainly reliant on social housing providers as an arm's length provider. A lot of councils now are providing in-house services, but what we might call social housing, so those not-for-profit housing providers alongside councils themselves, they have a big role to play. I think it's quite hard to see in many ways. I think people want to. They should be able to own their own homes. Yes. But that doesn't mean you don't have a strong social rented sector as well. We do see a lot of money in the UK spent on housing benefit on homes that would have once been social homes, but went into private ownership. And I think we've got to say, if you're a bigger family in a part of the country with higher than the usual housing costs, in a lot of parts of the country that means you're going to be in poverty unless you're on a really significant wage, and that is really tricky. So look, for me, more homes is about more to buy, more to rent, more social rent. That's all part of it. But I suppose the balance really you've got to decide is how much money do you want to use to subsidise social housing, and how much to make sure you've got the infrastructure as well. And I would always say I think that concern about infrastructure, health services, education services, transport, that's a really big concern. And you can't have everything in the quantity you want. You've got to get a balance right. But I think the whole thing can be done better.
I mean, I cycled to the Conservative conference and I cycled to the Labour conference, and what I saw at the Labour conference were policies. What I saw at the Conservative conference, there was a lot of culture war and cancellations of policies like HS2, which in my opinion must basically cause a lot of mess in the transport
absolutely.
policy in the plans of the North.
Absolutely, well, I agree with that. I suppose the strangest thing was that, look, if a party's been in power for 13 years and you're the incumbent Prime Minister, you broadly expect the election campaign you would fight would be to say, look, we've had some tough times, things are getting better, don't let the other guys in yet, don't let the other lot in yet, stick with me. What you saw from the Prime Minister was him saying he thinks things aren't great and they need to change, but he's the change candidate, even though he's the incumbent Prime Minister. Now, obviously for us, 13 years in and you say you're the change candidate, I don't think people will buy that. But I think what that meant was he had to find things that were different. So what I worry about, I think the cancellation of HS2 is a terrible decision, certainly for Greater Manchester and for the whole country. But I worry that his motivation for that was simply to find things to say, I'm different, I'm doing things differently. So it wasn't really a good long-term decision. It was just that short-term need to be able to say, I'm a change from my last Conservative Prime Minister. They seemed to did that. And that is awful. HS2 for us was about better local services, because you must take the faster services off the line. We obviously here in Tameside very much need what was called Northern Powerhouse Rail, so a high-speed line from Liverpool to Hull. that was dependent on the line from HS2 on the west side of Manchester, coming in, but Liverpool to Manchester would have used that capacity. So that was awful. Some of the stuff was really silly. I mean, before that we'd seen, the cancellation of imaginary policies, 7 bins, compulsory car sharing. I think people thought that was a joke, and it was. So I was really worried. But you're right to say this culture war area is a big concern. I mean, in any conference, it should be a big organisation. You should hear some different, varied views. But to see government ministers talk about, these internet conspiracy theories, this 15-minute city stuff, most people would like some good local shops in the town centre and good local services. So I really worried about that, and I think that is probably the direction that a lot of people on the right wing of politics will go in based on that conference, and that isn't good. It's not good for anyone.
Yeah, I mean, worst case scenario, it's only going to go worse should Labour go into power, depending on what happens with the
and I think if they use net zero around that, I mean, look, let's be clear. If you look at some of those decisions the Prime Minister changed, so one of them was higher energy efficiency measures in the private rented sector by quite a few years in the future. Now, he framed that as saving people money. That's going to cost you money.
Yeah.
If you're in a property, and obviously if you're an owner-occupier, the idea is you will invest in that because your own bills will come down. Now it's a different set of incentives if you're rented because you don't own the property. Unless you've got some kind of long stop date in there, well, you're going to have higher energy bills. There's this saying that you can't. I learned this a few years ago. They're saying that you can't build a Swedish barn to the standards of an English house. I mean, that's there's some. If you look at our energy efficiency compared to Europe, it's really not good, and it will cost people money. But as well as that, what policy in this area should do, it's not about what the cost of those measures are now. It's about how can you increase the deployment of those, so the added scale over time brings the cost down. So unless you've got a set of policies in place to make sure over time more and more people are improving the quality of the homes, the housing stock, how they're heated, how they're insulated, you won't deliver that.
Yeah.
And of course that's really what business needs. It just needs a certainty in that rollout. It'll invest in the supply chain to do that. But it was a really bad set of policies for the long-term health of the country.
Yeah, I agree. So, talking about what I saw in front of the conference, all those little groups that are trying to lobby the people as they go into conference. I saw people that were campaigning for PR. For me, as a voter, I'm a relatively new voter because I'm a new British citizen. So I look at the first past post system, and I'm frustrated because it feels as I always have to vote against the party I want to get into power rather than the party I really want to. Yeah. And millions of people, maybe they realized this decades ago and they don't even bother to vote anymore. Yeah. How do you feel about the first past post?
Well, I think a lot of people locally here in my constituency and beyond that know that I've always been a supporter of change, similar views to yourself. I formed this view very early on in my life. I grew up in at the time would be considered a very safe labour area in the northeast, obviously the mining towns. Everything's more competitive now, but I always felt really how people vote should broadly determine the makeup of the parliament. I mean, that doesn't seem that controversial. Now, in a national capacity, there are different views in Labour on it. So we haven't got a policy in favour of change. At the minute, we've got a number of constitutional changes, particularly around the House of Lords, and much more of a focus on devolving power to local areas, which I think is an important part of this too. I think, to be frank, we were always careful that if you're the opposition, it looks like you're focused on changing the rules of how it works, and you're still in opposition. You can look a bit like, are you saying you don't think you can win on the current system? Have you lost an election and you want to change the rules? Is the danger? But there are lots of people, who in the Labour Party act very active campaigns around looking at constitutional change, and I think it's an important part. You should always be looking, how can you improve your political system? And I don't think anyone thinks the British system is perfect, So it's a space of, I accommodate and always accept that my view is one and there's many in the party, but you know, I always think you should be looking at improving your democracy, and that should include everything from the voting system to where power is exercised. You know, more powers for cities, I think, is a good thing. I think who can vote, the age that people can vote at, you know, that's an important part of the conversation as well. We're looking at all of these things, but you know, we're not of the view that everything's working great at the minute.
Yeah.
And it needs to change. And I think you're right to say people. I think when they've been given a chance, and maybe the Brexit referendum was part of this, they were willing in a lot of cases to say, look, we're sort of a favour. We want to change. We think things aren't working great at the minute. We're in favour of that change, no matter how it is represented to us. So I've got some more people to win round, I think, to the cause, and it's I accept it's maybe when people's, again, when the cost of living pressure is so extreme, you've got to focus on the economy, you know, living standards. That's an important bit. But yeah, democratic change is a big part of what we look at as well.
Yeah, I mean, for the people that like advertising for PR, it would be very depressing if Labour ended its term, hopefully at least 2 terms in government, and we were going to get back to a circle where the Conservatives get in for 2 or 3 terms, and it just seems like a never-ending circle.
I always say, I mean, look, we do see elections where votes are sort of split between different challenges, but I would never frame this as I want this because I think it's good for my particular political viewpoint. You know, I think everyone should want whatever their own preference or you know, who's in power and is it who they voted for. You just want a healthy democracy. You know, I think we've seen, particularly with some recent Conservative Prime Ministers, some really unhealthy things where that was Liz Truss ignoring due process and having a budget which is, you know, really affecting people around here, the mortgages and what they pay, and businesses and business investment and the rate of borrowing. I think, you know, if you look at the behaviour of Boris Johnson, you know, again, even if you were a Conservative, you shouldn't, and I don't think people do, want to see a Prime Minister behaving in that way where, you know, issues around probity and the truth in what's said to Parliament, and obviously these parties in lockdown and following the rules. This does erode support for the whole political system. So the case for change is going to be, in any area, is this, you know, something we can all get behind because it will improve the whole system over the long term.
So another prominent group that's always there, also in front of Parliament, is Stephen Bray and his merry men arguing against Brexit. Now, like, if you look at all the reports, all the government reports say that every form of Brexit makes us lose out on what we had before. So my question would be, how will a Labour Brexit, how will that be different from what we got under the Conservatives?
So I mean, look, probably one of the most difficult periods in Britain's history. It's certainly difficult to be an MP. I mean, as you know, here in this constituency voted Leave, but the majority of, say, the people who elect me, my vote, the Labour vote here, would have voted Remain, but there would have been a significant Leave element there. So you've got lots of different elements. And I'd say, first of all, look, Brexit's happened. You know, we have left the European Union now, and then the deal that we had, I don't think would be available. You know, we've got to accept that it's happened. This is where we're at. When people ask us about why not just, you know, people are dissatisfied with it, why not make the case to go back in? Look, first of all, you do have to respect the result. I mean, I think that's an important part of this. You're right to say it has cost us, you know, it's had an impact on the economy, which is an adverse one. But I don't think that was just the reason people voted for it. There are lots of different reasons in there, but you know, there was a lot of information about the impact it would have, and it's had that impact. In terms of how you make it better, look, what I genuinely believe is that there are real practical steps we could undertake to make that relationship better on a whole range of areas. Now, I think that is honestly better than just refighting the whole thing forever. I think that would potentially never end, and we wouldn't move on, and to be honest, it would mean the kind of environment, the political environment in the UK was one where we weren't focused on other issues, whether that was public services or net zero or the energy transition, and we've got to look to the future. So the practical things that we would like to see happen would be things like, we want what is called an SPS agreement with the European Union. That's basically for for agriculture and food products, so you reduce the bureaucracy on trade to and from the UK and the EU. To give you an example, at the minute you wanted to take a cow into Northern Ireland, I think it'd have to be on the same piece of land for 40 days and you need a full kind of veterinary certification process for that. You know, we've got the same food standards, so can we remove those checks? We'd like to see professional qualifications mutually recognised. We're a services-led economy in the UK, that would be hugely to our advantage. A labour mobility agreement, so people can more easily, from school trips to business trips to the creative industries, you know, who've really suffered out in terms of their access to the single market. Genuine things. For the automotive sector, we make a lot of cars in the UK. We are going to be hit at the end of the year by what are called rules of origin at the minute, because not enough of the supply chain would be in the UK, and if there was a tariff there, we export most of what we make in the UK. That would make that really hard. So these are real practical based improvements to the deal that we think are deliverable. Excuse me. And I also think fundamentally we've got to be a good faith neighbour.
Yeah.
You know, you will always be our biggest market for our export products. We will also always be our major ally, our major friend. You know, I think some of the language we've seen from the Conservative Party in terms of almost kind of wanting things to fail in Europe to prove the point of what we have done. We shouldn't see it in that way. We should want to, whatever your view on this, you should want a strong European Union, because that's a strong market for us, a good ally, a good friend, and they should want the same of us. And I think that's just that more refreshing, better relationship is available, and some real practical improvements to the deal too.
Yeah. The Shadow Secretary for Trade and Business, so it must look very difficult when you look at the US spending billions on the Green Deal, and then you look at Europe doing something similar. Are we at risk of, for instance, not getting the investment we want to do, what we want to do on the green economy, because we are like in between, and investment will go away from the UK?
You're absolutely spot on. That's the worry. Inflation Reduction Act from President Biden. It's a major piece of legislation. It's the US is acting like a Hoover, sucking in green investment from around the world, and it is very effective. And I admire it, because I think to see finally the US sort of step up with that level of ambition, this is really important. But it means for ourselves, and the EU has also responded, there's a danger of us. And we've always been, for many years, certainly the last decade, an economy with not enough long-term investment, not enough business investment, with an economy with the lowest business investment in the G7. So we've had that long-standing problem, and now we've got the US kind of, you know, hoovering up the rest of it, and needs a response. So for us, that is about having a proper industrial strategy, long-termism, far too much short-term changes of policy in the UK in recent years. We have what we call our green prosperity plans. That's public investment we'll put in to try and bring in a much greater amount of private investment. Examples of that would be the need for battery factories for the automotive industry. We've seen even this government put money into the gigafactory that Tata want to build in Somerset. But you need a clear criteria for that. You can't just have, you know, me and you're a company, I'm the government, here's a bit of money, old-fashioned subsidy. What are you trying to deliver? What's the criteria? How are you making sure you negotiate with all potential partners to get the best deal? The steel industry, you need, every country in the world is a big developed economy, has a domestic steel industry. So it's a matter of really national sovereignty as well as your economy. We need to make this transition to green steel. That's using hydrogen in blast furnaces or converting to electric arc furnaces. Again, this government gets this, but there's no real explicit commitment to that. But as well as that, the reason the US has had to put so much into subsidy is there are things in terms of regulation of industry that you know, aren't politically acceptable in the US. You wouldn't get them through you know, the American legislators. So we've got more options available to us. And it doesn't mean we have to match the fiscal firepower of the US, but it does mean we've got to be more competitive on planning, on skills. And I don't mean a kind of a deregulatory race on that, because actually we're for stronger employment rights. We think that's an important part of the agenda. But it is accepting that the minute investment's not going to come to the UK on the scale that we needed, and that has huge implications for the net zero, for the transition, but just also for good jobs in all parts of the country. So really our whole agenda is it responding to this, getting more investment into the UK, growing the economy more strongly, but in a way that provides better jobs, good jobs in all parts of the country, and from that the tax revenues to pay for better public services.
Oh, excellent. had cycled to your conference, I wouldn't be asking about this because it happened the weekend after, really, didn't it? So we had this attack of Hamas in Israel, and then we had the response of Israel. And as someone who is a member of the public, it just looks as if one massacre results in other massacres, and I don't really see how this is going to solve anyway. And when you see politicians, it feels it's hard viewing to see people arguing on tally. What is your position on that?
It's a horrible situation. I mean, since this event first happened, I find it's the kind of thing where you're thinking about it all the time. When you go to bed, when your mind's wandering, because you're remembering really the human suffering on all sides. And one of the things about being an MP, obviously, there are times when you have to have access to intelligence information, conflicts. We've seen in Ukraine the terrible things that happened after Russia's occupation of parts of Ukraine, and yet some of the things I have seen and read that's it, about in the last week about this conflict have been things that you would never really have wanted to believe could happen, in terms of the brutality, the lack of humanity of that. Now, you can't be a politician in the UK without having an interest in the Middle East, the UK's history in the Middle East, that going back to 100 years, and the Balfour Declaration, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Lawrence of Arabia, the story of Arab nationalism in the First World War, and then the promises made. It's a part of it. We obviously, under the League of Nations, Britain ran the mandate in Palestine, and it's very, very difficult. I've been to the region maybe 3 or 4 times myself, actually, it's hard to get into Gaza, but the West Bank, different bits of Israel, actually bits of Lebanon as well. I was taken aback, first of all, by, even for a conflict which has been going on for so long and often does flare up, the Hamas incursion into Israel, and particularly what happened at the music festival and at the kibbutz, was a level of sadism, brutality that I find just really, I wouldn't even say it. I find it hard to articulate what I am aware of what happened. I think everybody who has any knowledge of Israel and Palestine knows the solution is a two-state solution. Now, actually, support has waned for that in recent years. People think, could we have one state? Could maybe everyone get along? That is not feasible. And I think you've got to make a clear distinction between the Palestinian Authority, no matter how imperfect that is, the Israeli government, no matter how imperfect, what we think about any particular Israeli government, and Hamas, who are a terrorist organisation. And any government, any nation, having experienced what happened when Hamas made that incursion, are going to want to get their hostages back, their people back. They're not going to abandon them, and they're going to want to be able to say to their people, we are going to defend ourselves and not allow this to happen again. Now, I think that can be done, and should be done, and must be done in a way which is consistent with international law. And now none of us sitting in this country can make determinations about certain things that we've seen. There's a lot of misinformation. You've got to have the International Criminal Court as the arbitrator of that, and their investigators. But we can definitely say that whatever is happening in terms of neutralising that threat from Hamas, the humanitarian side of that, access to food, water, medicine, particularly if that comes through Egypt, or how we deliver it to people, that absolutely has to be done. But you cannot get away from the sheer amount of suffering.
Is it possible, though, to do it respecting the law, given that Gaza is such a small enclave? I mean, it's physically, to a certain extent, impossible to sort of separate Hamas from the mainly civilian Palestinian population, just because of the geography.
I see what you mean. I know we always have to make clear that the distinction between Hamas as a terrorist organisation and the the majority of Palestinian people in Gaza. But I think, first of all, is it possible to do that in accordance with international law? Yes. I mean, we should never be of a view that you can't do it. It is true that Hamas has essentially structured themselves in such a way which is, you know, deeply embedded in civilian areas for a reason, particularly around trying to avoid airstrikes or retaliatory activity for firing rockets into Israel. And of course there is an incredibly vast tunnel complex underneath Gaza which sustains that. So it is not in any measure an easy thing, but yes, absolutely. Any military action has to be done in accordance with international law, and that's really about the decisions you're making around, you know, where you're targeting, where you're using munitions, how that operates. I'm afraid it doesn't mean that it's in any way a good situation. I mean, we can see that. I hope there is a way, and I hope through some of the international pressure that can be applied, you know, those hostages have to be returned.
Okay.
And I think you have to get to a point where, you know, I still believe a two-state solution is absolutely viable. It will of course mean very difficult things for either side. You know, even on the Israeli side, there's a lot of settlements in the West Bank in particular that would have to be part of Palestine. Well, but of course they did leave Gaza, and you know, I understand the Israeli person will probably say to me right now, well, look, we left those settlements in Gaza, and this is what we got for it.
I mean, that's where my next question was going to be, because, like, I think the argument is that Israel needs to be within international legal perimeters, but Israel, on the settlement issue, has not been respecting any international laws for quite a while. The current government seems to be introducing a law where they put the executive over the judiciary. So they are putting themselves over their own law. So how can we expect Israel to abide to international law when a lot of their own ministers are using language that's quite despicable, and when they actually, some of them, I think their defense minister has said that their aim is to actually annex part of Gaza when they're actually going in, which is against international
law. There's no
law.
way that would be possible. I mean, I think when we do, everything, you know, can end in peace eventually. And that will broadly be on what we call the 1967 borders of Israel. So essentially the territories that were occupied by Israel at that point Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights actually from Syria. Now, when you have this, I've had this discussion many times with different people, different viewpoints of Israeli society, and they will say, well, look, we did withdraw our settlements from the Golan Heights. We did withdraw them from Gaza. So yes, it will be difficult. There'll be some people who don't want to be part of that, but we've done it. And they've got a point on that. I mean, they do have a point. I think, obviously, in any negotiation, I would imagine, simply from the passage of time, there'd be some land swaps and agreements around there. But it would be hard and be painful. But I think, particularly on the judiciary point, very, very worrying, those judiciary reforms in Israel. But also you see the strength of Israeli society, which is a democracy. I mean, the protests on the street, the role of, you know, people across a whole range from you know, the armed forces to the intelligence services. Israel is a very rich democracy in that regard. It's had in recent times the nature of their electoral system and how prone that can leave, I think, coalitions to, you know, to be frank, political forces that are deeply different to my tradition and I guess the original traditions, because people will know a lot of, you know, the origins of Israel were in very left-leaning, idealistic, you know, people trying to build a country, the kibbutz system, and, you know, obviously it's that area in southern Israel which was the strong point of the old Israeli Labour Party. So it's difficult. There's no doubt about that. But, you know, I do also say the fact that you've got in Israel a Supreme Court that has at times, you know, really held the government to account. That you know, this is something Israelis feel is often underappreciated, which is whatever the faults, and there are faults. You know, for instance, an Arab or Muslim citizen of Israel would have far more rights in Israel than in any other country in the Middle East. You know, that is a reasonable point, and I think one thing we're also sort of missing from the debate at the minute is that the timing of this attack from Hamas does seem very much to relate to an attempt to frustrate what have been a really series of positive changes where, you know, Israel and Bahrain and the UAE have reached a kind of peace and normalization agreement. With Egypt, that happened in 1978. Saudi Arabia might sign a deal, and you know, the idea of perhaps this being a conflict between particular communities maybe changing a little bit, with actually, you know, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries arranged against Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas. That's a big change, you know, and I think I always remember, actually what I think was, I'd recommend anyone looks this up and reads it, but if you know, the closest we've ever been to peace in my lifetime would be the era of Yitzhak Rabin, who obviously was assassinated by an extremist in Israel, but his funeral, look up the speech from King Hussein of Jordan, you know, who talks about, he's doing a eulogy at Yitzhak Rabin's funeral. He talks about how they met as soldiers, yet they both reached across that divide. They knew they had to bring their own people to peace. It's incredibly powerful. It was actually the first time he'd even been in Jerusalem, and you know, it's a reminder of how even in the hardest conflicts you can always find that way, and I think that's possible. It feels pretty bereft at the minute, but it's possible.
Yeah, but talking about Rabin, who probably did the most to get to work towards a peaceful solution, he was assassinated by parts or by a group which is part of its members are now actually in the government in Israel. Actually, one of them was holding something up that they got out of his car before he was assassinated. I can't remember his name, but he was on the news at the time saying, look, we can get this out of his car, what else can we do to him? And also looking those peace processes with Saudi Arabia, that's all very good, but there seems to be no interest to actually change the situation of the people in the West Bank.
Yeah.
Even in Eastern Jerusalem, there's still land possession or land taking of Palestinians going on now. Should the UK, as a friend of Israel, not say, look, you need to restrain yourself, what you're going to do,
there's no doubt.
What you're going to do is only going to breed more hate.
And when it comes to, you know, settlement expansion, I would expect any UK government minister to make clear that Israel's security needs a prosperous, viable Palestinian state in the long term, and anything you do that undermines that or makes it harder really isn't in your national interest. And in terms of this conflict, look, there is a huge danger of escalation, which again, it would suit nobody to have a wider regional conflict, and you know, there's been some worrying times this week. But I also think you have to acknowledge at the start of that, any country is going to want to defend itself, or it's going to want to defend its people. I don't think anyone in Israel would accept a situation where they felt it was just a matter of months before another attack of this kind could happen. You know, and equally, I don't think in any democratic society you would be able to leave, you know, hundreds of hostages. I mean, if we did it per population, kind of per capita, this would be thousands of British hostages being held in this way. I just don't think it would be in any way feasible or right, to be honest, to abandon those people. Now, that doesn't mean we should ever lose sight of, you know, what is it not. You know, the thing I suppose about this is, it's so obviously, if you look at the long term, what do we all want to get to? It's not what we would call a zero-sum game. It's not one side gains and one side loses. Both sides need a viable two-state solution. You know, that's the way it will be, and we should never lose sight of that. You know, sometimes from the worst situations, it creates, by getting to somewhere which is so bad, the space for, you know, a solution. And in the past, there have been to be honest, Israeli prime ministers on the right, people none of my politics, who've turned out to be quite surprising in the sense that they have, I suppose, well, even if we didn't do it on people's viewpoint in political terms, but obviously people like Yitzhak Rabin were decorated soldiers. I mean, he'd been a warrior, yet he found the way to recognise that wasn't the way forward. He used that as the inspiration for peace, and we have to hope. I think, to be honest, one of the genuine problems has obviously been, and there's no, again, easy solution to this. You've had a real estrangement on the Palestinian side between Hamas in the West, Hamas in Gaza, and Palestinian Authority Fatah in the West Bank. And if you can't get unity of cause on that side, it's very hard to then negotiate a longer term solution. So these are hugely difficult issues, but they do need a solution.
Is what's happening now, do you consider it to be proportional though? Because like moving 1 million people seems to be like immense. I mean, I can't even understand.
Well, I think you certainly can't be talking about permanently relocating people. That would not be proportional. But I, to be frank, if you are going to have military activity in a civilian area, then you have to forewarn people of that and give them humanitarian corridors out of that and access to the essentials of life: water, food, medicine, electricity. And so if it's about making sure people are safe or safer, I don't think we could ever say they'd be safe in an environment like that, but if it's about recognising the impact on that is the right thing to do. It can't obviously be about people being asked to be permanently relocated.
Yeah, I'm sort of looking at it from a human way. I'm feeling very uncomfortable with the government and any politician really not saying to Israel, look, this is not the way, you can't just move 1 million people, bomb and destroy their houses while they are away as well.
Well, you must target military facilities. I mean, that is, the law is very clear on that. And I don't think, to be honest, I think one of the
But that's where I'm coming back to my earlier question. Is it even possible to have a military intervention in Gaza that's legal, because it's just so densely, everything is...
Is it possible? Yes. I mean, any military action, again, we should never be in a position where we're saying a military action is could be done in a way that's incompatible with international law. I go back to that point. I mean, I think I just cannot see a situation where we would accept abandoning people who've been taken hostage in that way, or leaving the threat on a border. I mean, people, they want to be safe. The nature of what has happened here, there is no feasible way to say, that doesn't have to be dealt with in a way which, gives people some hope. I mean, we don't know what the fate of those hostages is. It's clearly, it's almost not a good situation. But I think we've got to understand any country will have to defend itself against a threat like that. And actually, I think there is a danger to, I think there is a very clear distinction between, say, the ideology of Hamas to that of Fatah. The Palestinian Authority, the classic Yasser Arafat political movement, is a nationalist movement. It's about a home for the Palestinians and security for them. Hamas is much more akin to a terrorist organisation and is of an ideology in terms of whether it could ever accommodate. Hamas have successfully undermined a lot of peace initiatives or steps towards them, the Oslo Accords and coexistence work. I mean, I think you've got to recognise they're a barrier to a peace settlement rather than someone who'd be an active partner of it.
Yeah, but looking at what's going to happen, I have the impression that a lot of people, innocent people, are going to be displaced, killed, in whatever's going to happen. We're probably not going to get the hostages back neither, because they are probably going to get killed as well. And I'm just wondering whether the UK politicians should not be looking at other ways to say to Israel, can we not look at prisoner exchange to get the hostages back, rather than give them carte blanche to do something.
It's not carte blanche, but I think sometimes in this country I see some people say things like this, and I think there's no way people would accept the same. If it was people telling us to behave in this way, I think if we'd had the kind of abduction, murder, mutilation, children, elderly people, I mean, the account of the music festival and things like that. Even I think one of the first people who arrived who tried to help was actually an Arab paramedic, and what happened to him. We've got to be self-aware enough to recognise that we would not tolerate a threat like that on our border, and to lecture people from the security of this country that somehow they shouldn't seek to keep themselves safe or to get back people who've been abducted. I just don't think that is realistic. If this resulted in, perhaps the kind of thing that you're proposing there would be seen as a victory for Hamas. It would be, but they would say they'd succeeded in that, and that will only perpetuate the cycle of violence and increase the chances of it. So I think we've got to say, the starting point has got to be Israel's going to defend itself in the same way we would. Of course, we should use our counsel, our advice, our guidance, always to try and produce an end game, which is, in the end game's got to be that two-state solution.
Okay, thank you on that.
Pleasure.
I just watched the footage of my talk yesterday with Jonathan Reynolds. Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate you took the time to see me, by the way. And I thought I would summarize. I think on PR, it's good to know that Jonathan is in support of it in principle. Won't be seeing it in the manifesto this time round, I think, because Starmer is so dead against it. But who knows? Once Labour is in government, maybe it will make it onto their manifesto for the next election. After that, one can live in hope. On the Middle East conflict, it was good to hear Jonathan's opinions on it. Personally, I think that a lot of organizations are already saying that Israel is breaking international law, committing war crimes now, and they haven't even invaded yet. So I do not share his opinion that it's actually possible to go into Gaza and act within international law. And I don't think there's any consequences for Israel. So I think international law will be broken, and Western governments and anyone who supports Israel and doesn't urge restraint is supporting them in breaking international law. But that's just my opinion. On Brexit, I've been writing to Jonathan for years about Brexit, so I'm not surprised in his position. However, it's interesting that he acknowledges the cost of Brexit, that he acknowledges that comparatively it's putting us into a weak position because we are in direct competition with Europe, with the EU, with the USA, and that investment will go towards the bigger trading blocks, especially if those trading blocks put in policies that attract that investment, and the UK will be playing catch up. I think in the long term that uncompetitiveness and all those obstacles that we put in our own way will make rejoining the EU inevitable.